So today I'm gonna talk about box modeling. And what is box modeling? It's basically this concept that we use in web design to modify block elements. And we are able to modify block elements in 5 different attributes. So I'm gonna right click this website here, and then I'm gonna go to inspect, and here I'm gonna show you this just for a second so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm gonna make this box a little bit bigger so we can all see it. So I'm going to select H1 and you will see what I'm talking about. So each block element has 5 things or 5 attributes that we can modify that are related to box modeling. The first 2 are width and height. So this number here, this 743, is the width. Now, by default, the width is always the entire 100% of the screen. So basically, each block element will tend to use 100% of the available space on the screen. That's by default. We can modify that as we go, and in that way we can create layouts, and we can modify and put boxes in different places and things like that. But at this point, just we can modify these values, at least the width. We can also modify the height, how tall the element is. So in this case, for example, I can do 300 width. And you notice that now this element here is just using 300 pixels of width, basically just 300. Now, if I go here, I can also modify the height, how much height the element use. So I can, instead of 73, I can do 200. And now my element is bigger. Now, notice this, because I'm working with text, I have modified the height and the width of the element, but that didn't change the font size. So that's different. Just keep that in mind. When we want to change the font size, we use the font size property. If we want to change or modify the height and the width of the element, we use height and width. Okay, I'm gonna refresh this so we can go back to our original state. We can also create a border. So basically, a border is a line that we can put around our element. Okay, so I'm gonna do here, I'm gonna close this a little bit, put it to the left, and I'm gonna create a rule here for my H1, and I'm gonna put a border around it. Now it's gonna be, so there is when we use border, there are 3 values that we have to provide. We have to provide how thick we want the line to be. So in this case, I'm gonna do 3 pixels. What kind of line we want to have, so that's the second. In this case, I'm gonna do solid. And the third value that sometimes is not required is the color. In this case, I'm just gonna put a color of red. So now I have a border. Now, there is another attribute that I can add or can modify, which is the padding. Now, The padding is a value or an attribute that is between the height and width of the element and the border. So we can create some space within those two elements. So in this case, that's the padding. In this case, I don't have a padding yet. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna close this and I'm gonna add a padding of, I would say, 20 pixels. Now, notice right away that this element became bigger. And that's kind of the main point of padding. Padding help us to make sometimes these elements bigger than they are. Okay. The next value that we can modify using box modeling is margin. And our margin is basically the space outside our element after the border that collides with the next element. So basically at this point, our margin basically will collide with another margin in the next element. So I'm gonna show how this works in a little bit. So I'm gonna create a margin for my H1. In this case, let me see how much. I know that H1 has a margin already. So if we can see here right now, you can see now that the H1 element has a padding of 20. That's the value that we pass, right? Padding 20. Border of 3. And by default has a margin of 21 pixels. I can change the margin if I want. Now, if you go here to the P element, the P element has a margin of 16. But if you notice well, and you start looking at the orange space, what's going on here? So I have my H1 with 21.440 margin. And then right away, it seems like the margin from the P overlaps with the margin of the H1. So that's called collapsed. And what it does is the browser calculates or try to say, hey, I have these two elements basically together, or they are touching each other and their margins are touching each other. I'm just going to use the margin of the element that is bigger than the other one. And that's going to basically, the other one, the smaller value is just going to overlap. So let me show you how that might work. So we are going to take the H1 and keep it as is. And then I'm going to put a P element here. And my P element is the margin of the P element is going to be 30 pixels. Notice that the P element moved. So let's inspect it and see what happens. So if I go here to my main and inspect the P element, now I can see that the browser is basically recognizing the biggest margin value between the H1 and the P and saying, hey, the P element has the biggest margin. So that's the one that I'm going to use between these two elements. And that's what is collapsing. Other concepts about box modeling, just to do a recap at this point, we can change width, height, padding, border, and margin. Those are the 5 attributes that we can change.